Hello and welcome. We have heavy fighting along the whole front line, some impressive combat footage right from the vicinity of Kreminna. More information about Russia's mobilization efforts, more information about tank donations towards Ukraine, and a general overview of the political fighting that is happening in Russia as well. This and more in this situation report. There has been another massive air attack against Ukrainian cities. 55 cruise missiles were used by the Russian side. Among them were KH-101, KH-555, Kalibr and Kinzhal. All of them have been used in this attack. Ukraine says from the 55 missiles used, they were able to shoot down 47, as well as shooting down all of the 24 used Shahed 136 and 131. There has been a big recon attack in the direction of Ternova, close to Kharkiv. Russians were claiming, this is here, Russians are claiming they advanced 500 meters deep into Ukrainian territory. I have no confirmation whether they stayed there, but there's fighting here in Ternova again. I don't know why the focus from the Russian side is on Ternova, but we see attacks now and then every few weeks in that direction here. At the same time, also proving to the Ukrainians that they must keep a strong presence along the joint border with Russia and Belarus in this regard. On the Eastern Front, we generally have very little change in control of the territory here, but the fighting along Kreminna is intensifying. We have still fighting. A lot of the towns along more or less up to Novoselivsk are mentioned in attacks in combat, but no changes here. But we have some geolocated footage from fighting that is creeping closer towards Kreminna. This first is a Russian VDV unit. Those are the air assault groups that are being ambushed by Ukrainians. We can watch it here, and it doesn't show any casualties. So in this regard, I can show it on the in the situation report. That should likely be a BMD-4. That's the infantry fighting vehicle of the Russian air assault units. You saw him putting his head down and locking the hedge. And that was it. You could see them shooting with their 30mm autocannon, basically just spraying. I don't think they saw anything, but it was geolocated here, east of Dibrova. This is on this map here. This was more or less here. We have further videos of fighting that are no longer far away from the city, from Kremina itself. We have a fighting here, also taken from the VDV. You can see the fortifications they've built there, the trench lines, also the thickness of the forest, which obviously makes it really difficult to use armored fighting vehicles in this combat. This is why the front line is likely moving so slowly, because it's mostly infantry against infantry without much support from tanks. I have one difference here. It's also from the same area. I cut the video at the end because then the drone shows Ukrainian casualties and I cannot show this here without getting trouble with YouTube. So what you can see here is also interesting, that it shows a BMPT from the Russians being used in combat, of which we have very rare video image. So this supposedly is a Russian tank driving here. It's not always as clearly visible. And that should have been the BMPT. As said, I can't really identify much. You see him shooting inside here, shooting towards the side. That's the BMPT again with his autocannons. You see again also more or less spraying. This is, by the way, from that video. This is a BMP-2, I think, from the Ukrainians, supposedly, that was taken out here. And here you see the Ukrainian flag clearly. It should be a T-72B, I guess. Not completely sure, but you see one getting into safety, maybe wounded, but T-72 here. This is an excerpt. It's more or less the video that was part of that article I showed you, where the Asian newspaper couldn't get the caliber of the BMPT right from the beginning, but rather changed it every time it wrote about it. Here it is also being geolocated, and this is actually already here. So right south of Kremina, it should be more or less in this area here, in this here. So the Ukrainians are, the shortest distance I've read is that supposedly they are 1.1 kilometer at the outskirts, away from the outskirts of Kreminna. They are definitely creeping closer. We have images of fighting, geolocated images of fighting here, even though obviously it's that doesn't mean they necessarily control the area, but they are getting closer towards Kremina. The while there's some advances towards Kremina, overall north of the Siversky Donetsk, it hasn't changed much. South of the Siversky Donetsk, the Ukrainians are now admitting that they lost Soledad, which they probably lost like almost 2 weeks ago by now. They are saying they stabilized the front line northwest of Soledar, but that is not completely true, because first of all, they claimed they did an orderly withdrawal from Soledar after inflicting heavy casualties. That seems likely because we have not seen video images of captured Ukrainians, of significant numbers of captured or destroyed equipment. They said they withdrew after causing high casualties, and the high casualties on the Russian side are also without any doubt in existence, even though the Ukrainians are likely suffering heavy casualties themselves. While they say they have stabilized the front line, there are further advances north that are proven, both in the direction of Vasyukivka and from Bilohorivka in the direction of Vesele. There's another Bilohorivka here, and in this direction they have advanced, and they have advanced in this direction here. So they are more or less, like by now they have definitely cut the line of communication north here and are creeping towards Vasyukivka, which is probably also already cut the line of communication towards Siversk. Again, that does not mean the Ukrainians have to evacuate everything north of it. You can see that there are still 2 lines of communication going towards Siversk, both further north here, more or less in this direction, and one along the Siversky Donetsk. But they've cut another one, so should the Ukrainians now feel the need to redeploy units from Siversk to Bakhmut, they would more or less have to drive this area here. The interconnectability along the front line is breaking down massively with the last advances from the Russian side. Further south, the Russians are also achieving more success. There have been a lot of attacks on Bakhmut themselves. I cannot confirm any change in the control of territory here, but when it comes to south of it, the Russians are advancing from Klishchivka further west-northwest. In two places, more or less, the Russians are now 2 kilometers away from the T0504, which is this route here, this route, the road from Kostiantivka towards Bakhmut, one of the main lines of communications left, as the one in the north here is about to be cut, and then there's the road here that is left towards Chasiv Yar, but the Russians are creeping closer and are about to cut the communication line into Bakhmut from the west, directly from the west. Again, like I said in the past, we should not be surprised if the Ukrainians evacuate and give up Bakhmut within the next week or two. By now, Bakhmut obviously has gained a significance in the context of the war that is far outpacing its actual strategic value. I think we can kind of compare it to Hamburger Hill. If I remember correctly, I've watched that video ages ago, but as far as I remember, the fighting for that hill was more or less because the other side fought for it. This is not new in war, but if an opponent focuses on a certain area of a front line, he basically forces your attention towards it. And at that point, should the Ukrainians do the strategically and probably even tactically sound decision to give up Bakhmut fairly soon, then they would hand over Bakhmut and would allow the Russians to claim a big victory, even though it's completely or mostly without relevance to the strategic situation of the war, even to the operational situation of the war. By having won Bakhmut, the Russians would get a morale boost, and the Ukrainians would learn that they've lost that town that so many of their own soldiers fought for, and this more or less causes what's it called, sunk cost fallacy in a certain way, that the Ukrainians increasingly will likely feel that they have to keep fighting for Bakhmut, whether it's strategically sound or not, simply for the fact that they cannot allow the Russians the victory here. Other than that, around Avdiivka, we also have some reports that the Russians probably gained a little ground in Vodiane and from Pisky in the direction of Pervomaiske. Every time not big advances, but it's likely that over the last few days they gained a little ground in this direction and a little ground in that direction. There's also fighting reported at Marinka, but I cannot confirm that there's any change in the control of territory here. In Vulidar, on the other hand, the Russians have definitely advanced and are creeping towards the edges of the town. As I said in the past, Vulidar, basically that whole bulge here into that whole Ukrainian bulge is highly important, because it is what allows the Ukrainians to block that rail line here, which would, if it is if the front line is pushed away far enough, allow the Russians to much more easily supply their fronts along the whole southern front line. When it comes to the southern front line, we have reports about that the fighting in Zaporizhzhia is continuing, but that it likely has kind of slowed down. There are indications that the fighting might be more in the direction of gaining Ukrainians' attention, gaining maybe some tactical advantages like a better defendable position or something like this, but mostly to draw the attention of the Ukrainians here, as there are claims that a big Russian offensive is about to happen and Luhansk is one of the likely targets for it. So basically every reinforcement the Russians are able to draw down here will obviously not be available, at least not directly, at the moment they start an offensive at another position. Other than that, we have continued artillery fire, nothing new here. Also, again, like for whatever reasons, the Russians keep shelling Kherson with incendiary ammunition, which is banned by the Geneva Convention against a populated target. And as Kherson still has civilian population, this should be a war crime according to this. Generally, we can say that the Russians are likely going to do a big offensive in the near future, which means like within the next 2 to 3 months. The likely point for that offensive seems to be Luhansk, likely aiming to both recapture the whole of Luhansk, which was briefly under Russian control, and then advance further in the direction of Kupiansk, Liman, Izium, and maybe even Kharkiv again, pushing forward in this direction to push the Russians away. The Ukrainian intelligence and signal intelligence has by now identified, for instance, that parts of the 2nd Motorized Rifle Division out of the 1st Guards Tank Army have been moved from Belorussia into Luhansk. Before that, again and again, there were new units being identified having been moved there, with a lot of tank units with T-80, for instance, and fresh VDV units that have also been moved there. Also, a Kremlin insider has told Bloomberg, or several, they claim at least, Bloomberg claims that several Kremlin insiders have told them under the condition of anonymity that Putin wants a big massively new offensive really soon, because he thinks that this is what's necessary to gain the initiative again, and that Russia in long term will win the war because of its higher tolerance for casualties in this regard. In this regard, obviously, we can see that the attacks in the south here might be in that connection, that they are meant to pull away reserves further south. On the Crimea, the Russians are reporting that they have now replaced the 3rd of 4 damaged bridge elements that are scheduled to be replaced there. So there's only one left, and supposedly they are going to replace it on the 31st. They still haven't updated their schedule that the bridge will be back in fully operational at the end of March, but supposedly their repairs are advancing fairly fast now. That was it already from the front lines, from what we have, the news we have about the front lines. When it comes to the mobilization, CNN, according to CNN, Putin wants to mobilize 200,000 additional men, but the Kremlin did surveys within Russia that told the Kremlin that another mobilization wave would be highly unpopular. According to that, the CNN concludes that the mobilization might be in secret, which means that they might not announce a new mobilization, but rather call people up without doing it with a TV announcement like it was done in the first time. On the Crimea, for instance, there are reports that companies as well as state entities are being required to hand over lists with all male staff that is working in those companies within the age for mobilization, that is relevant for mobilization, and they are supposed to hand it over until tomorrow, I think. So in this regard, it shows, it fits the puzzle, what we've heard in the past weeks, that in various regions or within Russia, either preparations are advancing for an open second wave of mobilization, or at least that the mobilization without special announcement is happening right now or is about to happen in the near future. Other than that, we have claims by the Ukrainians that the Russians are recruiting Ukrainians inside of the occupied territories in big numbers. Supposedly, they force them into Russian uniforms and then send them to the front lines without sufficient training or equipment to be used as cannon fodder there. The Article 51 of the Geneva Convention is banning the forced recruitment of civilians, of personnel inside of occupied territory, either for combat units or for auxiliary uses, but that would be another war crime here by the Russian armed forces. The Speaker of the Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, has asked the Defense Committee as well as the Security and Anti-Corruption Committee to do a study on the possible punishment for those who discredit combatants. The aim here seems to be clearly that Wagner fighter as defenders of the fatherland should no longer be criticized. It's also aiming at the discrediting of them in regards to that they are using convicts here. This is likely due to Prigozhin's influence, but a legalization of Wagner seems highly unlikely. Almost we can probably almost say for certain that it's not going to happen for simple political reasons, as long as Wagner is staying an illegal operation, as PMCs are illegal according to the Russian constitution. As long as Wagner thus is running an illegal operation, he's basically a criminal, which allows the Russian government and thus Putin to take out Prigozhin and his forces whenever he feels the need to. So they are completely dependent on the government's support, which allows the government to use them at will. And now, as Prigozhin has turned himself bigger, we see signs that he's being cut to size, I think is the English expression, that he's being shown his place overall. The economic mobilization is also advancing. The government has now proposed a law which will likely be introduced and signed that would allow confiscated private property to be used basically for defense purposes. So far, apparently, the law requires confiscated private items to be destroyed, but in the future that would allow materials, machines, everything to be handed over to the Ministry of Defense and thus being used for military purposes, if obviously it is possible to do so. This will surely not have a big influence on the war, whether they confiscate a truck or two, or maybe a machine, a drilling machine or anything, but it shows us how much Russia is mobilizing into details that they think about things like this, where the actual benefit for the production of war material will likely be negligible. They are still doing it to maximize the output. We can see Russia moving towards preparation to, well, I'm not comfortable to really use that term as it has a Nazi background, but they are more or less moving towards a total war in this regard. At least they're showing preparations in the mobilization that they're increasingly preparing their country for a total war if necessary. According to the GUR, 40% of the lower officer ranks on the Russian side are currently not occupied. GUR is the Ukrainian military intelligence. All of this obviously would mean worse leadership, worse coordination with other units, thus more friendly fire incidents, less efficient fighting, less combat power, and higher losses. This shows us that simply increasing the numbers will not solve fundamental problems, but obviously quantity is a quality of its own, that, as supposedly Mao has said. So a massive new mobilization should not be discarded right away, even though the combat power of 200,000 additional Russian soldiers would be less than in a comparative other situation by another country. In the political sphere, we have interesting informations that Kremlin and mill bloggers are all discarding the relevance of the delivery of tank deliveries. We have here, for instance, TASS, the Russian press. I think it's government run, and according to that, the Kremlin speaker Peskov said that delivering Leopard tanks is quite a failure for technical reasons. So basically, they are saying it's not that dramatic. Telegram is also, the Russian military bloggers are saying he dislikes the hysteria. HIMARS were much more important. Sasha Kotz, the famous Sasha Kotz, for instance, also says that why there's all the fuss about this, which is kind of interesting because they discard how important it is. While in the past, for instance, when Patriot missile systems were delivered, there was a big drama about it. They talked about an escalation of a conflict for a defensive for an air defense system, while combat tanks are being discarded. This makes the impression that they actually take it serious and that they want to calm down the population, as causing fear in this regard is obviously not very useful. And this theory at least would be reinforced by something like this, where we have a video coming from the Russian side where they supposedly are already handing out information leaflets for Western tanks to teach their crew how to fight them best. Now, if the tanks are useless and if they are completely too big and too difficult to operate and the Ukrainians are not a danger in them anyways, then why do you teach your units already, probably 2 to 3 months before the tanks even arrive, how to fight them? Kind of a contradiction in itself, but still interesting in this regard. According to Energoatom, which is the Russian, the Ukrainian energy company, Russia is now recruiting Belarusian engineers to work in the CNPP, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Enerhodar, because so many Ukrainians are refusing to work for the Russians. In Donetsk, there are reports that the 3 mines have been closed down due to the lack of workers, lack of suitable machinery, modern machinery, and for financial reasons that they don't make profit. But at the same time, it was published that several mines in the region have been privatized because private investors were found. Obviously, this implicates, when we talked about Putin's more or less legalization of corruption, that this happens a week after this. I guess we shouldn't be too surprised if the new owners of those mines might be Prigozhin, maybe Kadyrov, maybe some Russian some Russian generals in this regard. So it seems likely that this is already happening in this regard, that the first spoils of war might already be handed out. Interestingly, Girkin and Prigozhin had a fight, were publicly accusing each other, discrediting each other. Some were calling, like military bloggers from Prigozhin's area were calling Girkin, also known as Strelkov, who was mentioned quite a lot on this channel here, a coward for his role in 2014, that he gave up Sloviansk and things like this, while Prigozhin was attacked in turn by Girkin. That could be seen, it's a sign of how the infighting is happening here, but also obviously it could be a means for Prigozhin to show his loyalty towards Putin, because Girkin didn't hold back with his criticism of the Russian government in the past, and he even said something which where he said personally, where he basically made a suggestion that Putin will be personally responsible if that war fails. Putin has signed a law that that now turns Medusa, Important Stories, Bellingcat, The Bell, and The Insider. Most of them have already been used here on this channel. They are opposition media or independent media publishing in Russian. They are turning those in undesired organizations, and it's now illegal in Russia to publicize their work, to publish them, and to support them either financially or in any other way. Also, Russia there's been a decree by the Russian government introducing 27 new penal colonies in the occupied areas, 13 in Donetsk, 7 in Luhansk, 3 in Kherson, and 3 in Zaporizhzhia. Where the last one is, if you've counted, I have no idea, but those 27, and at the same time, I just only mentioned 26. Still, those penal colonies are freshly introduced. We have 2 options, more or less, what they could be used for. One would be for the internment of Ukrainians that are suspected of supporting the Kiev government or even partisans, that they would be incarcerated in those penal colonies, or it might be used also for the incarceration of mobilized personnel that refuses to fight, that refuses orders, as obviously locking them up is makes much more sense to do it close to the front line, where they can be pressured to rejoin the forces without much logistical effort, and at the same time they should be incarcerated as far away from home as possible so their family doesn't realize what is happening. All of this makes perfect sense, so we should probably expect those penal colonies to be used for either of those, or maybe for both of those uses. There are also rumors among the Russian military bloggers now that Russia is going to force correspondents to wear blue protective vests. So far, Russian military correspondents were using Russian military uniforms, protective vests, insignias. I've mentioned it a couple of times in the past that we had claims by Russian media that they were attacked, and then you could see their cars with a big Z on it or Z on it, that they were having the white armband, things like that. So they were running around with Russian insignia. Supposedly the Russian government wants to change that now and wants to force them to wear the blue vests. Obviously, the military bloggers are not happy about this. They claim they will become an easy target for the Ukrainians, who will then know who to attack. But at the same time, obviously, this will allow the Russian government to identify military bloggers who so far were able to just be around soldiers without being specifically identified. And that would allow Gerasimov to take control over the information sphere in this regard, as he would be the one, as the Russian military would be the one to be able to control where those correspondents go and thus shape the informational battlefield in this regard. If that was actually the intention, then it might not be fully successful in the long term if Wagner continues to operate as it does right now, because that Wagner is going to obey those rules is fairly unlikely. So military correspondents with Wagner will still be able to wear uniforms of the Russian armed forces, will still be able to hide among them, which should likely increase the voice for Wagner, for its propaganda potential, and thus more or less contradict the assumed intention of Gerasimov to introduce this as a measure to control the informational battlefield. So it might backfire in this regard. When it comes to the support, Poland has now said they're going to send 60 modernized tanks. 14 of those will be Leopard 2s, 30 will be PT91 Twardy, and it's unclear what the rest is, but it's likely going to be T-72 M1R, the Ukrainian modification from that. Canada has now committed 4 Leopard 2 A4s as well, and we have claims by Poland of a new tank coalition, and it's interesting that the Turkish flag is in the background when this is happening. Now, Turkey has Leopard 2 A4s, but it seems highly unlikely that Turkey is going to hand them over, as those are their most modern tanks. Turkey has nothing better than the Leopard 2, while they have a lot of older tanks from Leopard 1s, where they have 300 or 400, down to even M48s. They have M60, M48. Some of them are highly modernized, especially the Sabra that was modernized with Israeli help, up to 120 millimeter smoothbore cannon. So they have still, even though some of those tanks might be old, all of them are updated to 105 millimeter cannons. Some of them have massive additional armor, modern electronics, modern fire control system, modern guns. So it's unclear as of yet. We assume that Turkey might help with those tank coalitions simply for the fact that there's a Turkish flag in the background, and then we assume what Turkey could send. Obviously, M48 patterns and M60 patterns seems to be the most likely thing, as it seems highly unlikely that Turkey is going to send its most modern tanks before they can be replaced with the Altay that is still not being mass-produced within Turkey. From Belgium, there are interesting news when we come to a famous arms dealer that is in Belgium here. We see that he has a fair amount of tanks here. Supposedly he has 50 Leopard 1 tanks. All of them should be Leopard 1 A5 BL for Belgium. And interestingly enough, we see here, if I'm not completely wrong, those might not be AMX 13, but Kürassier, so Austrian tanks, which also should have a 105 millimeter cannon, but I don't think they are up for discussion yet. Interesting also, I think those are actually driving school tanks in the background, if I see this correctly. Nevertheless, the Belgian government wants to help Ukraine but doesn't have tanks anymore. All of their tanks were sold. Those that are still remaining in Belgium are those inside of the company here, inside of the warehouse of an arms dealer. Belgium sold those tanks for 15,000 euros a piece, and the arms dealer wants 500,000 backwards, which obviously causes an outcry, but he explains, and at least according to the explanation you see here, that supposedly he would hand them back modernized. Maybe he had already modernized them to make them ready for sale. I'm not completely sure, but he mentions everything that needs to be done or that has been done, and he says it's still a business what I run here. I can't do charity, and somebody has to pay for this. So whether or not there's going to happen, something is going to happen here, whether another nation is going to buy them to just get this over with and unlock 50 MBTs in this regard is obviously unknown, but at least there's some potential within Belgium for additional deliveries. That's it from me for now. I hope I wasn't too unfocused because I'm suffering from a massive ear infection right now. I'm on antibiotics and painkillers, but I hope it was still not too drool what I produced here. In this case, obviously, it'd be highly interesting in your information, your opinion. You see how I lose focus. Your opinion would be highly interesting. What do you think? How do you actually think Turkey is going to commit main battle tanks in this regard and is going to help the Western coalition helping Russia, while at the same time Turkey has not even introduced sanctions towards Russia? These and other comments can be highly interesting and obviously help with the algorithm, as does a thumbs up in case you enjoyed the video. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting the channel. Other than that, if you haven't subscribed yet, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and recommend the channel to your friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.